take you now to a railway town at the junction of many tracks and many people. But the first junction was a junction of First Nations trails.
We dedicate this play to the First Nations on the Humber River, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and then later the Mississaugas, who were pushed from their communities by colonial settlement. We acknowledge their claim to this land.
As we celebrate 150 years of Confederation, we acknowledge too the tragedy that the fathers of Confederation did not respect the First Nations as founders of Canada, or their 12,000 years of history.
As we express regret and remorse, we hope you'll understand that today we also wish to explore some shared experiences and the struggle to be a better country.
Some of which began in West Toronto Junction.
My name is Eileeen. While studying to be a nurse in the Junction, I also broke the color barrier at a downtown Toronto cinema.
My name is Mrs. Julia Brown. I was an early merchant in the Junction. I owned a grocery store on Old Western Road. I carried everything from ice cream to coal oil.
A.B. Rice, journalist and customs collector. I covered the Junction for 60 years. For the record, when we speak of the Junction, we are referring to the historical boundaries of the city of West Toronto, which stretched from Bloor Street to just north of St. Clair, with its southern borders stretching from Jane to Dundas West, kind of angling up north of St. Clair along the railway.
Let's get started.
The Junction began as a collection of taverns. So it's surprising that for so many years, you couldn't get a drink in the Junction.
Perhaps one of the most famous of these is the Peacock Tavern at Dupont, Dundas, and Annette. William Lyon Mackenzie robbed the Royal Mail there in 1837. You know, right where the Coffee Time Donuts is now?
Canadians, do you love freedom? I know you do. Do you hate oppression? Who dare deny it? Do you wish perpetual peace and a government bound to enforce the law, to do to each other as ye would be done by? Up then, brave Canadians. Now is the day and the hour.
But of course it wasn't. Mackenzie led a band of armed men down Yonge Street to fight injustice and bring true democracy to Canada.
Fleeing from a hail of bullets, the rebel leader rode to the Junction with 50 men.
Whoa there. Right, stand and deliver. I want money to escape in any government communiques and put them in this sack.
Mackenzie escaped to the United States. There have been rumors that he fled dressed as a woman.
Don't even think about it, Mako.
Violence has never brought about change in Canadian political life, but the democratic ideas of the rebellion were later adopted by the reformers, and later, in some ways, the fathers of Confederation.
Had there been mothers of Confederation, there would have been a nation born with free daycare.
In the Junction, interest was not in politics, but in horse racing. In 1857, Charles Keel laid out the Carlton Racecourse, and a few years later, the first 4 runnings of the Queen's Plate were held there. And they're off from the corner of High Park Avenue and Annette. It's Don Juan, by Jockey Nelson Littlefield in the lead. They turn south onto Pacific. Don Juan still in the lead with a Canadian on it. On to Glen Lake, around the clubhouse turn, onto High Park, down the final stretch, and it's Don Juan by a nose.
In the first of 2 races, which were both won by Nelson Littlefield on Don Juan, the first Queen's Play.
Because the Queen was sometimes amused by a bit of horsing around.
7 years later, and 150 years ago, the Dominion of Canada came into being. Soon this fledgling nation had defined and connected itself with 3,000 miles of steel. The Canadian Pacific Railway.
built on the backs of Chinese Canadians, and in gratitude, the Canadian government imposed a head tax on anyone coming to Canada from China. There were certain aspects of being a progressive country Canada was still wrestling with.
Amen. Some of the first anti-discrimination laws in employment and housing were championed by the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, where many African Canadians got their start.
While the last spike of the Canadian Pacific Railway was driven in the West, it could not come together in the East because rival railway companies were keeping the CPR from the Toronto lakefront. So Canadian Pacific brought its eastern and western lines together where lines already ran north and south, creating a junction. Canada was complete. Enter D.W. Clendenin. D.W. saw the railway coming. He borrowed some money from a rich uncle named Laws, bought up the Carlton Racecourse. He laid out some streets and started selling lots. The junction's first real estate boom had begun. One man fought his way all the way from Yorkville in the middle of a snowstorm just to buy a lot. Then came the Heinzman Piano Factory, producing some of the finest pianos in the world. The Heinzmans hired craftsmen from the Jewish community who had settled on Maria Street from Eastern Europe.
The showman of the family was George Heinzman.
George Heinzman completed the first national tour as a musician, playing the piano from one end of the country to the other on the first Canadian transcontinental railway journey. Word is he passed out Heinzman brochures while riding the cow catcher into Port Moody. I'd moved to the junction by then. It's Baby Rice still, by the way, that was covering the story. Why, look, it's Miss Mary Cherry, principal of Western Avenue, later Indian Road School, one of the first women principals in Ontario. Good afternoon, Miss Cherry.
I'm really Mrs. Brown. I'm just playing Miss Cherry. Good afternoon, Mr. Rice. I'm out here campaigning to have the padlocks removed from the junction schoolyards so that the children can play in them after school and in the summer.
Generations of junction kids will thank you, Miss Cherry. Good afternoon, Dr. Reed. Dr. Minerva Reed, head of surgery at Women's College Hospital, founder of Sunnyside Hospital. What are you up to today, Dr. Reed?
I have been campaigning to have Western Avenue School renamed after Miss Cherry. As you know, she just retired.
Congratulations, Miss Cherry.
The only objection I have heard to changing the name of the school is that Miss Cherry is not dead. That objection will always stand, for her name will never die in West Toronto. Mary, I want to talk to those politicians again.
Minerva, let's not make a fuss.
Meanwhile, the junction grew to be a city. Unfortunately, the town had offered free water and freedom from taxation to industry, so the city was broke. So was Toronto. A marriage was arranged. This was no mere annexation of territory. It was an amalgamation of two cities. It was like a marriage preceded by a courtship. And in this case, the bigger city was the wooer. Before negotiation, junction folk thought little of amalgamation with Toronto. The people were proud of the difficulties they had overcome, and they were happy.
Some of you may know that the junction was dry for almost 100 years, banning the sale of alcohol. Women felt banning the sale of alcohol was just as important as getting the vote. The junction was an industrial town. Many men lost their lives in accidents while intoxicated. Women felt it was absolutely important to save their families.
surged into town for one last drink.
It's gonna be fierce up there. 10,000 men out on a tear, CPR boys loaded for bear. Last call before the junction goes dry. There's mud in the streets, here's mud in your eye. Great Canadian party, eh? All the way to Runnymede. You hear up the rebellion, but God save the Queen. Actually, Queen Victoria had been dead for 3 years, but she kind of rhymes with Runnymede. And while we're on the subject, the junction went dry before it became a city. It just fit the story better this way. When they closed the bars, they were replaced with theaters. 5 of them. The Wonderland, the Beaver, the Crystal, the Mavidi, and the Crescent, which the local kids called the Flea Pit. The junction has always had an independent spirit, but its greatest pride has been its citizens.
This time, I'm really Mrs. Julia Brown again. I originally came from Jamaica. I married a man whose family came to Canada on the Underground Railroad, fleeing from slavery in Maryland. When my husband retired from the CPR, we bought some land in the junction on Old Western Road. We sold some of the land and built a grocery store. We carried everything from ice cream to coal oil.
A combination which never quite caught on in the junction.
No, but the store was lit by coal oil lamps and heated by coal oil stoves. And it was so nice to sit by the fire and eat a dish of ice cream. But what our store had, and few others had, was cutting-edge technology. We had a telephone. And so I consider myself a pioneer in telecommunications. I charged a nickel to use it.
Mrs. Brown was well known for her generosity.
Wow, we had fruit trees on our property. One year, I sold some apples from one of the trees to buy fur-trimmed galoshes for the little neighbor boy who didn't have any boots.
That wasn't the only thing she did. She also...
Hush now. We helped each other. Now tell them your story.
Miss Eileeen, ladies and gentlemen.
I came to the junction because I wanted to be a nurse. There was much illness in Canton, which was important for me to help. Mr. and Mrs. Noyes were missionaries in my city, and they knew of my desire to study. So they arranged for me to come to the junction. I was 19 when I arrived, and I had to stay long enough to complete my public school education and 2 years of high school to qualify for my nurse's certificate. For 5 years, I had 4 brothers, the Noyes boys.
Come on, guys.
We used to go to the movies together, and that's where I met my best friend, Jean. Sometimes we'd go to downtown Toronto. One day we went to the Palladium. Now, in those picture houses, Chinese and other non-Caucasians were not permitted to sit downstairs, only in the balconies.
But on this one day, we were mistakenly sold main floor tickets at the Palladium.
The usher told us to go back to the balcony. We refused, and we began to scream. The audience turned their heads to investigate the uproar. The manager rushed out and enforced quiet.
So we screamed all the louder.
Ah! By this time, the audience was giving us support. Ah! The manager scuttled back to his office, and the confusion ended. We stayed in our seats and enjoyed the show.
As far as we know, Anne Leung had broken the color barrier at the Palladium.
We fixed them. But good.
As with all of Canada, people have come from all over the world, from different cultures and different beliefs, to the junction.
The junction boasts the oldest purpose-built synagogue in Ontario. It was the site of Toronto's first mosque, and it has a thriving Tibetan Buddhist temple. The spires of Victoria Royce, St. Cecilia's, and St. Paul's dominate the skyline. It is home to gentle atheists, those who are questioning their belief in agnosticism, and those who believe in the Great Spirit.
The Junction is just like Canada itself. Principled, but flawed, compassionate, diverse, and independent.
Happy 150th birthday, Canada!